3,000 years ago, across the sun-baked plains of northern Mesopotamia, a sound echoed that would freeze the blood of kings from the Mediterranean coast to the Zagros Mountains. It was the rhythm of 10,000 marching feet, the rhythmic thud of iron-rimmed chariot wheels, and the deafening roar of a military apparatus unlike anything the world had ever seen. When the dust on the horizon turned black with the banners of the god Ashur, cities did not just prepare for war, they prepared for the end of their world. History remembers the Neo-Assyrian Empire as the ancient world's apex predator, a relentless juggernaut of conquest, deportation, and calculated terror. They are often portrayed in the surviving texts of their enemies, including the Hebrew Bible, as an inescapable scourge, a tide of blood and iron. But empires are not born invincible. The deadliest war machine of the ancient Near East was not forged in a vacuum of luxury and unbridled power. It was born in the crucible of extreme vulnerability. To understand the rise of Assyria, we must strip away the myth of the bloodthirsty savage and look closely at the geopolitical reality of the Late Bronze Age. We must examine the anatomy of a society that turned itself into an army simply to survive. Our story does not begin with triumph, but with an apocalypse. Around 1200 BCE, the interconnected, globalized world of the Late Bronze Age violently collapsed. For centuries, a delicate balance of power had held the Mediterranean and the Near East together. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Mycenaeans in Greece, and the Kassites in Babylon had maintained a complex network of diplomacy, trade, and royal marriages. But within the span of a single human lifetime, this international system shattered. Cities from Troy to Gaza were burned and abandoned. Trade networks that had moved precious copper from Cyprus and tin from Afghanistan ceased to exist. Migrations of displaced peoples, often remembered as the Sea Peoples, ravaged the coastlines. The Hittite Empire, once a superpower, dissolved into ash. Egypt survived, but only as a shadow of its former glory, retreating behind the Sinai. The world plunged into a dark age of famine, mass displacement, and localized warfare. Yet, in the upper reaches of the Tigris River Valley, one state managed to weather the storm, the Middle Assyrian Empire. But survival came at a terrible cost. Assyria found itself utterly isolated. The geopolitical landscape had fractured, and into the power vacuum poured waves of nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes, most notably the Aramaeans. Driven by climate shifts and the promise of land, Aramaean tribes pushed relentlessly into the Assyrian heartland. Look at the geography of northern Mesopotamia, and you will understand Assyria's perennial paranoia. Unlike Egypt, which was protected by vast deserts, or Babylon, which was insulated by the marshes of the deep south, the Assyrian homeland, the triangle of land between the Tigris, the Upper Zab, and the Lower Zab rivers, possessed no natural defensive borders. To the north and east loomed the Taurus and Zagros mountains, home to fierce highland tribes who constantly raided the lowlands. To the west and south lay the open, endless expanse of the Syrian steppe, an open highway for nomadic incursions. For an agrarian society dependent on the fertile, rain-fed plains to grow their barley and wheat, this geography was a death sentence if left undefended. If the Assyrians waited for their enemies to cross their borders, their crops would be burned, their villages sacked, and their people starved. The strategic reality was brutally simple. The only viable defense was a preemptive offense. The Assyrians could not afford to be passive. They had to strike first, strike hard, and push the theater of war as far from the Assyrian agricultural base as possible. Over the centuries that followed the Bronze Age collapse, this geopolitical necessity was baked into the cultural and religious DNA of the Assyrian state. War was no longer just a political tool, it became a theological mandate. The Assyrians worshipped Ashur, a deity whose name was shared by their capital city and their empire. In the Assyrian worldview, the universe was divided into two spheres. There was the land of Ashur, which represented order, civilization, and cosmic balance. And then there was the yoke of Ashur, the chaotic, barbaric world outside their borders. The Assyrian king was not a living god like the pharaohs of Egypt, but he was the earthly vicar of Ashur. His primary religious duty was to expand the realm of order into the realm of chaos. To halt the expansion of the empire was to invite cosmic entropy. The king who did not march out with his armies every spring was not just a weak ruler, he was failing his divine mandate. This ideology of holy war provided the intellectual framework for an endless cycle of campaigning. When the king claimed in his royal inscriptions to have crushed a rebellion or subjugated a foreign land, he was not merely boasting of his military prowess. He was proving to the gods and his people that the universe was functioning as it should. This defensive militarism kept Assyria alive, but by the 10th century BCE, the state was suffocating. The Aramaean tribes had pushed so deep into the region that the Assyrian kings controlled little more than a thin strip of land along the Tigris. The empire had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. It was during this period of extreme constriction that the foundations of the Neo-Assyrian war machine were truly laid. The resurgence began with Adad-nirari II, who ascended the throne in 911 BCE. Recognizing that Assyria would slowly bleed to death if it remained besieged, he initiated a systematic campaign of reconquest. Adad-nirari and his successor, Tukulti-Ninurta II, did not strike out blindly. They launched highly organized, methodical campaigns to clear the army and tribes from the vital agricultural lands and trade routes of the Kapur River Valley. They re-established fortresses, secured the grain supply, and forced neighboring kingdoms back into vassalage. But the Assyrians of this era were fighting a different kind of war than their Bronze Age ancestors. The collapse of the international trade routes had made bronze, an alloy of copper and rare tin, prohibitively expensive. In its place, the Assyrians embraced the metal of the New Age, iron. Iron ore was relatively abundant, but it was incredibly difficult to work, requiring furnaces capable of reaching much higher temperatures than bronze. The Assyrians did not invent iron smelting, but they were among the first to industrialize it for military purposes. By equipping their soldiers with iron weapons, the Assyrians democratized lethality. Bronze weapons were brittle and expensive, often reserved for elite charioteers and mobile warriors. Iron weapons were cheaper to mass produce, more durable, and held a sharper edge. This technological shift allowed the Assyrian kings to arm a much larger portion of their population, transforming the traditional militia into a massive, well-equipped infantry force. With the homeland secured and the iron foundries burning, the stage was set for a ruler who would take this revitalized state and turn it into an instrument of terror and imperial dominion. In 883 BCE, a young king named Ashur-Nasir-Pal II took the throne. If his predecessors had pulled Assyria back from the brink of extinction, Ashur-Nasir-Pal was the architect who designed its true golden age and forged its terrifying reputation. Under Ashur-Nasir-Pal II, the Assyrian army evolved from a seasonal militia into a semi-professional force capable of projecting power deep into the mountains of Anatolia, the plains of Syria, and the shores of the Mediterranean. He recognized that to hold an empire, you could not simply march an army out, collect tribute, and go home. You had to establish a permanent presence. To achieve this, Ashur-Nasir-Pal fundamentally altered the logistics of the Assyrian military.
The historian Mario Liverani has pointed out that the early Neo-Assyrian Empire was not a continuous block of colored territory on a map, as we might imagine today. Instead, it was a network of communications, a web of military roads, fortified supply depots, and loyal vassal states. Ashur-Nasir-Pal constructed administrative centers and supply caches along his campaign routes. This meant his armies no longer had to forage to survive, allowing them to march faster, strike further, and stay in the field longer than any rival force. To manage this expanding network, Ashur-Nasir-Pal embarked on one of the most ambitious building projects of the ancient world. He moved the capital from the ancient, crowded city of Ashur to a new, magnificent metropolis called Kalhu, known in the Bible as Nimrud. Kalhu was not just a royal residence, it was a military-industrial complex. Its massive walls housed arsenals, barracks, and administrative archives. From here, Ashur-Nasir-Pal could marshal his forces, coordinate his intelligence networks, and display the staggering wealth he had extracted from the conquered world. But perhaps Ashur-Nasir-Pal II is best known for the chillingly calculated psychological warfare he introduced to the ancient Near East. Assyrian royal inscriptions from his reign are infamously explicit in their descriptions of violence. When a vassal city rebelled and withheld its tribute, Ashur-Nasir-Pal's response was designed to be so horrific that no other city would dare follow suit. His records boast of flaying rebel leaders alive and draping their skins over the city walls. He wrote of building pillars of severed heads, of blinding prisoners, and of burning youths and maidens in the fire. To a modern ear, this sounds like the pathology of a madman, but in the context of ancient geopolitics, it was a brutally rational strategy. The Assyrian army, though large, could not be everywhere at once. Sieges were costly, time-consuming, and drained the state's resources. By making a grotesque, highly public example of a city that resisted, Ashur-Nasir-Pal weaponized terror. The goal was not to fight every enemy, but to induce such profound psychological paralysis that rival kings would surrender and offer tribute the moment the Assyrian banners appeared on the horizon. The cruelty was the point, but it was a cruelty engineered for efficiency. Coupled with this terror was another logistical innovation that the Assyrians perfected: mass deportation. When a region proved stubbornly rebellious, the Assyrians did not just kill the inhabitants, they uprooted them. Modern historians, such as Karen Radner, have demonstrated that Assyrian deportations were not death marches designed to exterminate populations. Rather, they were highly organized, state-sponsored demographic resettlements. The Assyrian state viewed people as its most valuable resource. Rebellious populations in the Levant or the Zagros Mountains were systematically relocated to the Assyrian heartland or to newly conquered underpopulated agricultural zones. They were provided with food, safe transport, and tools. Once relocated, these deportees were put to work building new cities, digging irrigation canals, and farming the land. Crucially, by tearing these people away from their ancestral lands and local gods, the Assyrians stripped them of their political identity. Over a generation or two, surrounded by Assyrian culture and speaking the Aramaic language that was quickly becoming the empire's lingua franca, these deportated populations became Assyrians. It was a brutal but highly effective method of breaking resistance and simultaneously solving the empire's persistent labor shortages. Through iron, logistics, and terror, Ashur-nasir-pal II built a machine of conquest. But it was his son, Shalmaneser III, who would test the absolute limits of that machine. Taking the throne in 859 BCE, Shalmaneser inherited an army that was hungry for expansion. His father had secured the northern mountains and the eastern frontiers. Shalmaneser set his sights squarely on the west, the wealthy, strategically vital lands of the Levant, encompassing modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. The Levant was the geopolitical prize of the ancient world. It was the crossroads of trade between Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Its ports controlled the flow of cedar wood, purple dye, and precious metals. Shalmaneser understood that whoever controlled the Levant controlled the economic pulse of the Near East. Year after year, Shalmaneser led his armies across the Euphrates River, systematically reducing the independent Aramaean and Neo-Hittite states of northern Syria. His forces utilized highly developed siege warfare. The Assyrians were the first to employ a dedicated corps of combat engineers. When they approached a walled city, they did not just starve it out. They built massive earthen ramps against the walls. They deployed heavily armored battering rams, wooden beasts covered in wet hides to prevent them from catching fire, manned by soldiers who relentlessly pounded the mud brick fortifications until they crumbled. Sappers dug beneath the foundations, while archers, protected by towering shield bearers, laid down a suppressing rain of iron-tipped arrows. As the Assyrian war machine chewed its way southward, panic gripped the Levant. The fragmented kingdoms of the region, who had spent centuries fighting each other, realized that they faced an existential threat. Individually, they were insects before the Assyrian boot. Their only hope was a massive, unprecedented alliance. In 853 BCE, Shalmaneser III marched his army into the Orontes River Valley, near the city of Karkar in modern-day western Syria. There, waiting for him on the plain, was the largest military coalition the world had ever seen. 12 regional kings had put aside their bitter rivalries to form a desperate wall of resistance. The coalition was led by King Hadadezer of Damascus and King Ireleni of Hamath, and it included significant forces from the coastal Phoenician cities, troops from the Arab tribes of the desert, and notably 10,000 infantry and 2,000 chariots commanded by King Ahab of Israel. The Assyrian records, preserved on a massive stone stela known as the Kirk monolith, provide a staggering tally of the forces arrayed against the empire. According to Shalmaneser's scribes, the coalition fielded nearly 4,000 chariots, almost 2,000 cavalrymen, 1,000 Arab camel riders, and over 60,000 infantry. Even allowing for the inevitable exaggerations of ancient military propaganda, the Battle of Karkar was a clash of titans, involving over 100,000 men. It was the largest battle in recorded human history up to that point. At Karkar, the Assyrian war machine demonstrated the full spectrum of its tactical evolution. The core of the army remained the heavily armored infantry, fighting in disciplined formations with iron spears and large shields. But the Assyrians had also mastered the art of combined arms. They deployed elite units of chariotry, serving as shock troops to shatter enemy lines. A standard Assyrian chariot was heavier and larger than the light vehicles of the Bronze Age, carrying a driver, an archer, and a shield bearer, effectively serving as a mobile weapons platform.
More significantly, Karkar highlights a turning point in military technology, the widespread use of cavalry. In earlier centuries, riding a horse into battle was considered impractical. Horses of the era were relatively small, and without the invention of the stirrup, staying on a horse while fighting was incredibly difficult. Early Assyrian cavalry literally operated in pairs, like a chariot without the cart. One man held the reins of both horses, while the other fired a bow. But by the time of Shalmaneser, selective breeding had produced larger, stronger horses. Cavalry units, armed with lances and bows, were becoming a flexible, highly mobile strike force that could operate on rough terrain where chariots would bog down. When the two massive armies collided on the plains of Karkar, the slaughter was immense. Shalmaneser's inscriptions boast of a total crushing victory. He claimed to have slain 14,000 coalition soldiers, boasting that he made their blood flow through the wadis and used their corpses to dam the Orontes River. He wrote of capturing their chariots and forcing the rebel kings to scatter like birds. But if we peel back the layers of imperial propaganda, a very different picture emerges. In the ancient Near East, kings did not record their defeats. A stalemate, or a tactical withdrawal, was simply spun as a glorious triumph. While Shalmaneser undoubtedly inflicted massive casualties on the coalition, the strategic reality following the Battle of Karkar reveals the truth. The Assyrian advance was halted. Shalmaneser did not capture Damascus. He did not march into Israel. He was forced to return to Assyria, and he would have to campaign against this same Levantine coalition several more times over the next decade before the alliance finally fractured from internal pressure. The coalition at Karkar had achieved the impossible. They had looked the apex predator in the eye and held the line. The Assyrian war machine had been checked. In the aftermath of Karkar, Shalmaneser's long reign began to sour. The logistics of endless campaigning had stretched the empire to its limits. The king grew old, and the personal authority required to hold the military apparatus together began to slip from his grasp. Instead of leading the armies himself, Shalmaneser began delegating command to his top general, the Tartinu, a move that dangerously empowered the military elite at the expense of the throne. As Shalmaneser's life drew to a close, the empire was rocked by a massive, debilitating internal revolt led by one of his own sons. The crisis fractured the Assyrian heartland. For several years, the Assyrians turned their iron weapons not against foreign enemies, but against each other. To make matters worse, as Assyria bled internally, a new and terrifying threat was rising in the mountains to the north. The kingdom of Urartu, centered around Lake Van in modern-day eastern Turkey, had spent decades observing the Assyrians. They had learned their tactics, copied their administrative structures, and adopted their use of iron. Urartu was transforming into a mirror image of Assyria, a militarized, highly centralized state perfectly positioned to challenge the weakened empire for supremacy. By the early 8th century BCE, the momentum built by Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III had completely stalled. The Assyrian war machine was sputtering. The provincial governors were acting like independent kings, hoarding tribute and building their own private armies. The royal throne in Kalhu had lost its absolute authority. Urartian armies were pressing against the northern borders, threatening to cut off Assyria's vital supply of horses and metal. To the outside world, it looked as though the great Neo-Assyrian experiment was failing. It seemed that the empire would succumb to the same cycle of rise and collapse that had defined Mesopotamian history for millennia. The machine had grown too large, too unwieldy, and too corrupt. But Assyria was not dead. It was merely waiting. The geopolitical pressure cooker of the 8th century was about to force a catastrophic breaking point. Out of this period of stagnation and near collapse, a usurper would emerge, a man who would not just repair the Assyrian war machine, but completely dismantle and rebuild it into the first true standing professional army in human history. A man who would unleash an era of imperial domination so absolute it would alter the trajectory of human civilization forever. But that reckoning was still to come. The reckoning arrived in the spring of 745 BCE. In the shadow of the Great Ziggurats of Kalhu, a bloody and decisive coup swept through the royal palaces. The stagnation that had paralyzed the Assyrian state was violently broken when a former provincial governor, or perhaps a disaffected general, seized the throne. He took the name Tiglath-Pileser III, and he inherited an empire that was rotting from the inside out. Urartu dominated the north, Babylon was slipping away in the south, and the western vassals had ceased paying tribute. The provincial governors of Assyria had grown so powerful they were essentially warlords, operating with impunity and ignoring the dictates of the crown. Tiglath-Pileser III possessed a geopolitical genius matched only by his ruthlessness. He understood that the Assyrian war machine, originally designed by Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III, was fundamentally obsolete. It had been built on the concept of the Ilku, a seasonal levy where farmers were called up to fight during the summer and sent home in the autumn for the harvest. This system was sufficient for raiding and border defense, but it was disastrous for maintaining a massive, multi-regional empire. When enemies realized the Assyrians had to go home to reap their barley, they simply waited for autumn to rebel. Furthermore, relying on an agricultural militia meant that an extended, bloody campaign directly threatened the food supply of the Assyrian heartland. To save the empire, Tiglath-Pileser III fundamentally re-engineered the nature of human warfare. He abolished the reliance on the seasonal levy and created the Kishar Sharnuti, the king's standing army. This was arguably the first true professional year-round military force in recorded history. These men were not farmers moonlighting as soldiers. They were full-time agents of the state, paid, fed, armed, and housed by the royal treasury. They drilled constantly, standardizing tactics and weapon handling to a degree previously unimaginable. But a standing army requires staggering amounts of wealth to maintain, and it requires a continuous supply of manpower. Here, Tiglath-Pileser implemented a radical policy of military integration. As he marched out to crush rebellions in the Levant and the Zagros Mountains, he no longer simply slaughtered or deported defeated armies. He absorbed them. Conquered Aramaean infantrymen, Levantine charioteers, and Anatolian spearmen were stripped of their national allegiances, reorganized into Assyrian cohorts, and deployed to frontiers far from their homelands. The Assyrian army became a cosmopolitan polyglot juggernaut, held together not by a shared ethnic identity, but by iron discipline, a standardized command structure, and the unifying language of Aramaic.
To ensure that no general or governor could ever again challenge the throne, Tiglath-Pileser aggressively fractured the administrative structure of the empire. He took the massive, semi-independent provinces and sliced them into dozens of smaller, easily manageable districts. He appointed eunuchs to govern many of these new territories, ensuring they could not establish hereditary dynasties to rival his own. With his newly forged, fully professional war machine, Tiglath-Pileser unleashed a geopolitical tsunami. He marched north and smashed the armies of Urartu, driving them back into the Armenian highlands and besieging their capital of Tushba. He swept west, brutally subjugating the wealthy kingdoms of Damascus and Israel, transforming them from vassal states into directly administered Assyrian provinces. He fundamentally altered the political map of the Levant, erasing borders that had stood for centuries. But his most significant geopolitical maneuver occurred in the south. Babylon was not just another rebellious province, it was the cultural and religious motherland of Mesopotamia. For centuries, Assyrian kings had treated Babylon with a delicate, often frustrating reverence, attempting to control it through puppet kings and diplomacy. Tiglath-Pileser abandoned this pretense. In 729 BCE, he marched his professional army into Babylon, ousted its chaotic leadership, and took the hands of the god Marduk during the New Year's festival. He crowned himself king of Babylon. Assyria and Babylon were united under one crown, fundamentally altered the balance of power in the ancient Near East. Tiglath-Pileser had saved the empire, but it was the dynasty that followed him, the Sargonids, that would push this military-industrial complex to the absolute limits of imperial expansion. In 722 BCE, following another violent succession crisis, a king took the throne calling himself Sargon II. His name literally translated to the legitimate king, a moniker almost exclusively adopted by men who had stolen the throne. Sargon II inherited the professional army of Tiglath-Pileser, but he added a new, terrifyingly modern dimension to Assyrian warfare, a vast, formalized intelligence network. The historian Simo Parpola has extensively documented how the Sargonid kings operated an empire-wide surveillance state. Sargon deployed spies, informants, and scouts across the ancient world. His archives are filled with decoded letters from frontier posts, detailing the movements of enemy troops, the shifting allegiances of tribal leaders, and the economic conditions of neighboring states. The Assyrian king knew the price of grain in a hostile capital, and he knew which rival generals were susceptible to bribery. This intelligence gathering culminated in Sargon's masterpiece of military strategy, the 8th campaign of 714 BCE. Urartu had recovered from Tiglath-Pileser's assaults and was once again fomenting rebellion along Assyria's northern frontier. Rather than marching up the predictable valley routes where Urartian fortresses awaited, Sargon utilized his spy network to chart an impossible path through the treacherous, heavily forested Zagros Mountains. He led a massive combined arms force of cavalry, chariots, and combat engineers through unmapped mountain passes. The logistics of this campaign were staggering. The Assyrian sappers had to literally carve roads into the sides of mountains so the chariots could advance. When Sargon's army suddenly emerged from the highlands into the heart of Urartian territory, it was a strategic masterstroke of total surprise. He utterly annihilated the Urartian coalition at the Battle of Mount Uaush. Sargon then unleashed a calculated act of psychological and theological warfare by sacking Musasir, the holy city of the Urartian chief god, Haldi. The Assyrians looted the temple, carrying away tons of gold, silver, and the very statues of the Urartian deities. By dragging their gods into captivity, Sargon spiritually broke the kingdom of Urartu, neutralizing Assyria's greatest northern rival for a generation. To immortalize his triumphs, Sargon embarked on the construction of an entirely new capital city, Dur-Sharrukin, or the Fortress of Sargon. It was designed to be the physical manifestation of imperial ideology, a city of unprecedented scale, guarded by colossal stone bulls and decorated with miles of reliefs depicting the invincible Assyrian war machine. But the arrogance of the empire was met with a sudden, catastrophic reality check. In 705 BCE, Sargon II was killed in battle while campaigning in Anatolia. Worse, his body was lost to the enemy and never recovered for proper burial. In the highly superstitious world of the ancient Near East, this was not just a military disaster, it was a cosmic catastrophe. If the king was the earthly vicar of the god Ashur, his death on the battlefield meant the gods had abandoned him, and by extension, the empire. Panic swept through the empire. Sargon's son, Sennacherib, inherited the throne amidst a firestorm of rebellion. Vassal kings from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf took Sargon's death as a divine signal that the Assyrian giant had been mortally wounded. Sennacherib's first act was to abandon his father's magnificent tainted city of Dur-Sharrukin. He moved the capital to the ancient city of Nineveh, which he systematically transformed into the most spectacular, heavily fortified metropolis on Earth, equipping it with massive aqueducts and botanical gardens that some scholars argue were the true inspiration for the legendary Gardens of Babylon.
But Sennacherib had little time for gardening. The Western vassals, backed by the political machinations of a resurgent Egypt, had formed a massive coalition to break Assyrian control over the Mediterranean coast. Among these rebels was King Hezekiah of Judah, who fortified Jerusalem and defied the Assyrian crown. Sennacherib's response in 701 BCE demonstrated the terrifying mechanized efficiency of Assyrian siege warfare. He swept down the Levantine coast, systematically reducing Phoenician and Philistine cities before turning his war machine inland toward Judah. While Jerusalem survived due to a combination of tribute, plague, or perhaps logistical overextension, an event famously celebrated in the Hebrew Bible, the fate of Judah's second most important city, Lachish, showcased the apocalyptic reality of resisting Assyria. At Lachish, the Assyrian combat engineers constructed a massive siege ramp out of thousands of tons of earth and stone, paving it with wooden planks so their multi-ton battering rams could be pushed directly against the city walls. Excavations at Lachish, combined with the incredibly detailed stone reliefs Sennacherib later carved into his palace at Nineveh, provide a harrowing blow-by-blow account of the battle. The Judean defenders rained down fire, arrows, and boiling oil, building a counter-ramp inside the city to raise the walls higher. The Assyrians responded with suppressive fire from hundreds of archers and slingers, while sappers undermined the foundations. When the walls of Lachish finally breached, the violence was systematic and absolute. The city was burned to bedrock. The political and military leaders were impaled on stakes outside the city gates. Thousands of civilians were rounded up, categorized by their economic utility, and marched into the Assyrian deportation network. Sennacherib's campaign in the Levant was a masterpiece of calculated terror, designed to remind the world that the Assyrian machine had not died with Sargon.
Yet, Sennacherib's greatest challenge lay not in the west, but in the south. Babylon was in a state of chronic, violent revolt, continually stoked by the Elamite Empire to the east. For years, Sennacherib tried to manage the Babylonian problem. He placed puppet kings on the throne, including his own eldest son, who was subsequently kidnapped and murdered by the Elamites. Driven to absolute fury by the unending resistance and the death of his heir, Sennacherib committed an act of cultural sacrilege that shocked the entire ancient world. In 689 BCE, he marched his army into Babylon and ordered its total annihilation. This was not a standard sack. The Assyrians burned the temples, smashed the idols, and slaughtered the inhabitants. Sennacherib then ordered his engineers to dig canals through the ruined city, diverting the waters of the Euphrates River to wash away the very foundations of Babylon, mathematically erasing it from the earth. To the Assyrians, it was a final, brutal solution to an intractable geopolitical problem. To the rest of Mesopotamia, it was an atrocity of cosmic proportions. The destruction of Babylon horrified even the Assyrian elite. When Sennacherib was assassinated by his own sons 8 years later, many viewed it as divine retribution from the Babylonian gods. The throne fell to another son, Esarhaddon, who immediately set about rebuilding Babylon to appease the gods and stabilize the south. But Esarhaddon also recognized that the endless rebellions in the Levant were being funded and encouraged by the shadow power of the ancient world, Egypt. To permanently secure the Western Empire, the Assyrian war machine had to cross the Sinai Desert and conquer the pharaohs. The logistical challenge was monumental. Armies of the ancient world could not carry enough water to sustain tens of thousands of men and horses across the arid Sinai. Esarhaddon solved this by forging alliances with the nomadic Arab tribes of the desert, creating a massive supply chain of thousands of camels carrying water skins to keep his army alive as they marched on Egypt. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian war machine shattered the armies of the Nubian pharaoh Taharka. Esarhaddon captured Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, stripping it of its wealth and taking the royal family hostage. Assyria now controlled a continuous landmass stretching from the mountains of Iran to the Nile River. It was the apex of their territorial expansion. But empires often plant the seeds of their own destruction at the very moment of their greatest triumph. Governing Egypt was a logistical nightmare. The supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the wealth required to garrison the Nile Delta drained the Assyrian treasury. This burden fell to Esarhaddon's son, Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria. Ashurbanipal is a fascinating paradox. He was a highly educated scholar king who boasted of his ability to read ancient Sumerian texts and solve complex mathematical problems. He founded the Great Library of Nineveh, dispatching scribes across the empire to confiscate, copy, and preserve the entirety of human knowledge, an obsession that ultimately saved texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh for modern humanity. Yet this scholar king presided over the most hyper-violent, brutally vindictive campaigns in Assyrian history. Egypt continually rebelled, forcing Ashurbanipal to repeatedly march his armies back to the Nile, ultimately sacking the great southern city of Thebes. But Ashurbanipal's most devastating war was fought against the Elamite Empire in southwestern Iran. For generations, Elam had funded Babylonian revolts and served as a safe haven for Assyria's enemies. Ashurbanipal decided to remove Elam from the map entirely. The ensuing war culminated in the Battle of Ulai, where the Assyrians crushed the Elamite forces, decapitating the Elamite king and hanging his head from a tree in the royal gardens of Nineveh. But Ashurbanipal did not stop at military victory. He marched on the ancient Elamite capital of Susa and systematically dismantled it. The royal inscriptions detailing the sack of Susa read like a manual of absolute annihilation. The Assyrians looted the temples, desecrated the royal tombs, and dragged the bones of the Elamite ancestors into the sunlight to deny them peace in the afterlife. Ashurbanipal even claimed to have spread salt over the Elamite fields, ensuring that nothing would ever grow there again. By 640 BCE, Assyria had no rivals left. Urartu was pacified, Egypt was subdued, Babylon was occupied, and Elam was a smoking wasteland. Ashurbanipal sat atop an empire of unprecedented power. Yet within 3 decades of his death, the Assyrian Empire would not just be defeated, it would be entirely erased from existence. The collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire is one of the most sudden and spectacular implosions in human history. How does a military apparatus that successfully dominated the known world for 3 centuries collapse so completely, so quickly? Modern historians and archaeologists point to a confluence of systemic failures, demographic exhaustion, and environmental catastrophe. First, the very reforms that made the Assyrian military so powerful ultimately hollowed it out. By incorporating vast numbers of conquered peoples into the standing army, the Assyrian state fundamentally diluted its own core. By the late 7th century, the Assyrian army was mostly comprised of Aramaeans, Babylonians, and mercenaries. The native Assyrian population had been bled dry by centuries of endless campaigning. When the center failed to hold, there was no longer a fierce nationalistic militia left to defend the homeland. There was only a massive mercenary force whose loyalty depended on the royal treasury. Second, the empire simply outgrew its agricultural base. The massive administrative centers, the standing armies, and the sprawling capitals like Nineveh required staggering amounts of grain to survive. Recent paleoclimatological data, derived from stalagmites in the caves of northern Iraq, reveals that the late 7th century BCE coincided with a devastating, decades-long megadrought in the Near East. The rains that fed the Assyrian heartland failed, crop yields plummeted. The empire could no longer feed its sprawling cities or its massive armies, triggering economic collapse and famine. Finally, the brutality of Assyrian dominance had created a profound, unifying hatred among its subjugated peoples. When the Assyrian state showed momentary weakness following the death of Ashurbanipal, a succession crisis triggered civil war. Smelling blood in the water, the empire's enemies struck. In Babylon, a rebel named Nabopolassar seized the throne, driving the Assyrian garrisons out of the south. In the Zagros Mountains, the Median tribes united under a warlord named Syacrares. These 2 forces, the Babylonians and the Medes, forged a massive coalition driven by a single consuming desire, the total destruction of Assyria.
The Assyrians, plagued by drought, starvation, and internal division, fought a desperate retreating war. But the machine was broken. In 614 BCE, the Medes sacked the ancient religious capital of Ashur, butchering its inhabitants. In 612 BCE, the combined Median and Babylonian armies laid siege to Nineveh itself. The greatest fortress in the world fell. The coalition forces breached the walls, burned the magnificent palaces to the ground, and slaughtered the Assyrian elite. The remaining Assyrian forces fled westward, attempting to establish a final stronghold in the city of Haran, but by 609 BCE, they too were annihilated. The Neo-Assyrian Empire did not merely decline, it was decapitated. Its cities were left in ruins, gradually swallowed by the sands of Mesopotamia. Its language was replaced, its gods were abandoned, and its surviving populations were absorbed by the very peoples they had once terrorized. 2 centuries later, when the Greek mercenary Xenophon marched an army past the ruins of Nineveh, he did not even know the name of the people who had built it. Yet the ghost of the Assyrian war machine haunted the world long after its cities fell. Assyria birthed the modern concept of empire. They created the administrative blueprints that every subsequent superpower would inherit. The Babylonians and the Persians adopted their provincial systems, their methods of taxation, and their reliance on professional standing armies. The brutal efficiency of Assyrian logistics, the supply depots, the military roads, the integration of foreign troops laid the groundwork for the vast empires of antiquity, from the Achaemenids to the Romans. The rise and fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire stands as a profound testament to the paradox of imperial power. Through unmatched discipline, technological innovation, and calculated terror, they forged a state capable of mastering the world. They pushed the boundaries of human organization, building cities that scraped the heavens and libraries that captured the wisdom of ages. But their dominance relied on a system of perpetual violence, an economy of extraction that required endless war just to sustain itself. In engineering a war machine designed to conquer all threats, they ultimately engineered a world that could not tolerate their existence. Assyria teaches us that even the most invincible systems of power are terrifyingly fragile. They are bound by the limits of human endurance, the unpredictable forces of nature, and the inevitable, crushing weight of their own ambition. When the dust finally settled over the ashes of Nineveh, the silence that followed was not just the end of an empire. It was the closing of a brutal, defining chapter in the story of human civilization, a chapter written in iron and washed away in blood.